Shaunna and Alyson, welcome to the Best of Women's Fiction podcast. I had the pleasure of interviewing you for my blog, hastybooklist.com, but this is the first time we've met face to face, and I'm thrilled to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you too.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be here. Thank you, Ashley.
We're here today to talk about your novel, The Thread Collectors. So, will you start by telling our listeners what your novel is about?
Absolutely. So, in The Thread Collectors, you meet two couples. There is a Black couple, and that's comprised of Stella. Stella is enslaved, and she's at home in New Orleans, secretly taking repurposed thread and cloth to create these maps to help enslaved men covertly flee to join the Union Army. She's in love with Jacob. Jacob is a brilliant Black musician, also enslaved, and he decides he's going to run to join the Union Army as well. On the battlefields of Louisiana, he meets Jacob Kling. Jacob is a German Jewish soldier, and he's been encouraged to join the Union Army by his fiery abolitionist wife, Lily Kling, who's up in New York doing some sewing of her own. She's joined a quilting circle from camaraderie, and also they're creating quilts to send down to the Union soldiers for comfort and also to help fund the Union Army cause. So these four characters who come from different races, different faiths, different backgrounds, who might not seem that they have too much in common, by the end of the novel, you find out that they have much more in common than you would have thought.
The Thread Collectors is, Shaunna, it's your debut novel, and Alyson, it's your 10th novel, if I counted correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I love asking authors how they became authors. Their journeys to publication are so varied. Alyson, I read you majored in art history and Japanese studies, and Shaunna, you're a former corporate lawyer. So I want to know, how did your paths lead you to becoming authors? Alyson, let's start with you.
Okay, so, being an art history major in college, one of the things that I absolutely loved was telling the story behind a painting. I loved putting it in historical context. I loved looking for, the psychological clues that the artist was putting into the canvas of how he might have seen his, particular subject. I loved researching the cost, what they were wearing in the clothing. And I think that love of investigation, of research, and then trying to, when I would write my art historical papers, creating something that opened up a lens into a world that, is much more complicated than what at first meets the eye. So when I graduated from college, I thought to myself, if I could do anything in the world, what I would love to do would be to write novels about artists and how they experience history in real time. And that's what sort of led me to write historical fiction. All of my novels have someone who is creative or artistic as one of the main protagonists. And like the Thread Collectors, we do have a musician or two musicians. We have a Black musician and a Jewish musician who meet on the battlefield. So that kind of stays in line with what I've done since I had my first novel published in 2000. So I've been doing it for over 20 years.
And Shaunna, what about you? How did you come to co-write this book with Alyson?
Absolutely. So while I am a dusty, dry corporate lawyer, I majored in literature in college. So reading has always been something that spurred me, that love of language. And I'd always harbored dreams to write my own novel. I think when Alyson and I first met 13 years ago, I was so thrilled to meet an author. I think I almost thought that I was meeting like a unicorn in real life. And I probably admitted to her that first day that it would be my dream to write a novel. I did not know that the opportunity would be handed to me by one of my dearest friends, but I am so grateful that it has been. As for how we came to write this book, I'm happy to dive into that as well if you want, Ashley.
Well, I read that the story is loosely inspired by your family histories.
Absolutely. Alyson, you want to go first and maybe I'll layer on?
Well, yes, I mean, on my family tree, I have two great uncles who were sons of Jewish German immigrants that had come over to the United States in the 1830s. And these two particular, brothers, when they came of age, one went down to Mississippi to start a mercantile depot in Satarsha, Mississippi, a little town near the Yazoo County. And while his younger brother remained up in New York, and when the Civil War broke out, our family legend was that these two brothers fought on opposite sides of the Civil War, and that their relationship was never healed after the war, that this, decision to fight on opposite sides and take up, opposing views on fighting, against slavery basically severed the family forever. So I always heard that from my grandmother. And then I started to do the research. We learned about what regiment each brother was in. We, were able with the research also to discover the will of my Southern uncle, where he disowned his brother up north. So everything my grandmother had told me over the years had been true. So we certainly incorporated that fraternal relationship in the thread collectors, using that about two brothers who are, children of immigrants themselves, outsiders being Jewish in a new country. How that, plays out in our book is based on my own family tree.
And so for me, it's not as direct a connection, but when Alyson was first talking to me about this idea that grew into the thread collectors, that was back, I think, in 2017, which seems so crazy. I almost refer to it as like the before times, like before the pandemic. I then introduced this concept. Well, she had a loose idea, I think, of a Jewish soldier and a Black soldier meeting on the battlefields, and some map gets created. I was, as you might expect, really interested and intrigued by the idea of the Black soldier. And I said, well, what if he takes the map and he gives it to his beloved and she creates a tactile map? And that was in my head because while I am not a quilt maker, I come from a line of women who have created quilts. My mother was born on a cotton farm in Houston, Louisiana. And that idea, that rich history of textile in the African American community is one of the most direct lines. All of the Black women in the novel are named after women in my family, including our heroine Stella, who's named after my mother. And in particular, the matriarch of the Black women, Janie, was inspired by a great, great, great aunt of mine. Janie wrote, who, in spite of her race and the strictures of the time, managed to become financially independent and a landowner. And I had thought sometimes, like, I wonder the choices that she had to make in order to achieve that. And as we were writing the character of Janie, as we were writing a lot of these characters, Alyson and I were pulling from the stories that have been passed down and the questions we've had about our ancestry. So it was lovely to be able to weave that in.
So the story is loosely based on your family histories, but how did you decide to write this story together?
So as Shaunna touched upon, like in 2017, I had this very rough idea to use that fraternal relationship that I, just expanded on within my family, and to perhaps make it into a novel. And Shaunna, as she mentioned, contributed to these building blocks of that story. Even though I wasn't searching for a writer partner back then, I was literally just having a conversation with my friend who loves to read. And as she mentioned, was a literature major. And our whole friendship, we've been married for 13 years. We've been friends for 13 years. We've always been like, talking about books. She's my litmus test when I have an idea. But I was very excited when Shaunna suggested this whole other layer to the book about embroidered maps and bringing in, a love story, because who was, the Black soldier's beloved who could create these embroidered maps. And Shaunna was volunteering this information just out of the generosity of her heart and her interest. She wasn't, trying to say like, and I could be your collaborator. So I left that meeting in 2017 very much inspired and still thinking about writing this book. But I always like to say that when you embark on writing a novel, all the winds have to feel it on your back or steering you to do, this is the book you need to be writing at this particular time in your life. And I didn't feel that in 2017. I actually went out to write another book called The Secret of Clouds that I published in 2019. But fast forward to 2020, when we were in the throes of the pandemic and the world felt so fragile and scary. And then on top of that, the brutal murder of George Floyd, which really sort of cleaved open, I think, in our consciousness, how much racial injustice there has always been in the United States, but still is prevalent today. And so the themes of the Civil War, this curiosity to sort of understand what happened back then and how that divided our nation, started pulling me back in the direction of a Civil War novel again. But when I returned to the original seeds of the idea, I already knew that it wasn't wholly mine, that Shaunna had not just said to me, oh, that sounds like a great idea, Alyson, I think you should write that book, that she had contributed building blocks to the story. She had already sort of pressed her fingerprint, her heritage into the story. And I wanted to honor that. And I also wanted to, see, because I have known her for so many years and know that she's always wanted to write a novel, I had a very strong instinct that we would be able to collaborate on something and make something really beautiful and powerful with historical integrity, because she's such a scholar, and like, she knows, she's so curious about learning as much as I am. So I just thought, I think we'd make a good team. But when I called Shaunna, I think she was surprised that I was, saying, do you want to write this novel with me? Right.
I was very surprised. I think I hung up the phone and turned to my husband, who I'm actually married to, although he might think I'm married to him. And I think I said to him, she's crazy. Um, and I will say, Ashley, that it wasn't for me an immediate yes, not because I wasn't blown away by the offer, but it was because in 2020, particularly as a Black woman, I was feeling pretty wrung out, emotionally exhausted. My day-to-day job was leading a global organization in their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And to write historical fiction, you really have to live, in that time, in terms of like looking at all the source documentation. And I sometimes phrase it as, I didn't know if I could live through what I hope is the most racially divisive time of my lifetime, and then revisit the most racially divisive time in our country's history. So it took a little bit of, frankly, a little bit of nudging from my husband to really put it in context of what this ultimately turned out to be: a legacy project, a place for me to put some of those difficult emotions, a place to work through these questions of race with a dear and treasured friend, and a place to maybe do something that's educational in a way that people walk away knowing more than they ever could have. In a manner, though, that is maybe not as scary and confrontational as it sometimes feels. So I'm glad that I took the leap, but it wasn't right away, yes, for me.
That is a great segue into my next question. Alyson, like you, I'm a historian first. My focus was in fashion history. So the textile connection of this book really spoke to me when I was first reading about it. Research, therefore, is my favorite part of the writing process, and I love asking authors about their research. So, actually, Shaunna, I want to start with you because I imagine that research was quite difficult, quite heavy in many instances. So, I'm curious what researching that time period was like for you.
That's a great question. We're fortunate to at least have some institutions in the nation that focus on the lives of ordinary African Americans, because it was important for us to showcase what ordinary people were going through. I relied a lot on the Amistad Research Center, which is down in New Orleans. And because it was a pandemic and I was working fully remotely, I got to go and stay with my mama after being like hosed off with Lysol. Um, the Schomburg Center up here in New York, I live in Harlem in New York, and so that's only a few blocks away. They were wonderful. And also the Historic New Orleans collection. And part of the research was focused on free Black people of color, because we do have free Black people of color who are in our, not free people of color, sorry, who are in our novel. And the research that is pretty readily available, if you can imagine, like I'm holding letters from the 19th century in my hands. Where we have archival deficiency, and I think it says a lot about our country, is when you think about the day-to-day lives of people who are enslaved. You couldn't teach an enslaved person how to read or write. If you were caught, even a white person could face dire consequences. So most of what we have about the lives of people that were enslaved are either written by, their enslavers, or it's been passed down from oral history. And so that's not always easy to piece together. I know we often get asked, well, are there any records of people having created like these covert embroidered maps for enslaved people to run? We didn't find that exactly. We found in certain other circumstances, like Civil War saboteurs embroidering things on like the hem of their petticoat. And many of us have heard, for instance, about using quilts, in different directions and with different symbology to lead people to different Underground Railroad houses. But what I say about that time is I don't rule anything out, because the very people that were doing it often didn't have a way to write down and preserve for history what they were doing. I also had the ability to go to Port Hudson. The Battle of Port Hudson plays a really central role in our novel. it was a battle where Black men were finally given the opportunity to fight for freedom, similar to the battle scenes that are depicted in that wonderful movie Glory, although Port Hudson happened a few weeks prior. And they were, frankly, they were massacred. And it was a really dark time. Their bodies weren't collected for weeks. It was not the Union Army's shining moment when it comes to how they treated Black soldiers. And I spent a day there with the park ranger. And when I say you can feel the spirits when you're walking across that land, I certainly could. And even though it's only 90 minutes away from where I grew up, I had never been, which reiterated to me how important it is for Alyson and I to work on this project. And frankly, for historical novels, historical fiction to be out in the world to teach people things that they're never going to get taught in the classroom.
And Alyson, I'm curious if your process differed how you would write a solo novel versus how you co-wrote with Shaunna.
So my process didn't change. And it's interesting because when Shaunna and I decided that we were going to collaborate, we didn't so much talk about process. I mean, we definitely knew that we were going to work on a Google Doc, and I've always worked on Word. And the Google Doc was enable us to really jointly create the voice that we wrote the thread collectors in. A lot of readers initially thought, when we would come to book clubs or we'd do talks, and people would raise their hand and say, did Shaunna write the Black characters and did I write the white characters? And that's not at all how we wrote this book. Right from the beginning, we did want to create one seamless narrative voice that blended our hearts, our minds, and our histories together, so you couldn't tell who was writing what. And we did that by creating a Google Doc, and usually every Sunday night we would brainstorm 20 pages at a time. We didn't have a big outline of we didn't have an outline at all what was going to happen. We generally knew the intent and what kind of story we wanted to create, one that, showed history and pulled from our ancestry and was, at the end of the book, a book about hope, this bridge, the bridges that connect us rather than divide us. So we had like a feeling about this book, but we didn't have an outline for that book. And I never work for, on an outline. And it's funny because Shaunna never said, like, do we need an outline? She was very much like me, let's create something beautiful and powerful. And so going back to that methodology, we would brainstorm 20 pages at a time. I would go in and do, almost like a wire armature of the structure of what we had discussed with a thin layer of clay. And then she would put on her layer of clay and build out the story. And then I would do another layer, and then she would, and then 4 or 5 times back and forth on those 20 pages until we felt it really envisioned how we saw those particular chapters. Let's say that was, we write short chapters, so 3 chapters. And then we would slowly move on. And, and that's how I've written all of my stories, very much, like a painter, where one brushstroke building against the next brushstroke, and, being very conscious of saturation of color and description, and then space, negative space where you pull away and there's time for the reader to breathe in and process what's going on. We were just intuitively the same, I think, on how we created. And it's funny that we didn't discuss that, because now that we've been doing these panel discussions with other authors, and you hear about how, if there's a collaboration, they outline everything and they say, in this chapter, it's going to be from this point of view, and it's going to have this character coming in. We didn't do any of that. And that would have really thrown me if Shaunna said, I feel I need an outline, or, we need to pace out everything that's going to happen. Because I love the beauty of what sort of unfolds in a story when you're writing. And I've always done it that way. And not to speak for Shaunna, but we never discussed this. It just became, you and I just had a natural, instant synchronicity of creating together. Thank God.
I imagine that 13 years of marriage friendship in handy to be on the same level as far as how you're going to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Shaunna, did it come as naturally to you as Alyson is making it out, that you just kind of met her in her process, and that was your process too?
So I guess for me, and approaching it as not my day job, but a dream, I think it would have been less fun if it had felt as rigid. I have a ton of rigidity in my day-to-day life. If you saw my Outlook, you might faint. It's like carved down to 15-minute increments. So for me, this idea of just telling story is very much, even if you were with me at a dinner party, I would just start and it would just go, and then it might go in like a little tributary there. That is the way my mind thinks. And I think that allowed it to not only be more creative, more beautiful, but frankly more fun. I've never written a book by myself, although I have aspirations to, of course. But that's the beauty of being able to do something with a friend, because you want it to be fun, not only purposeful. And so if we had had an outline, I don't know, I think that would
It would
have
have felt really strict. But I will say, going back to your initial question, one thing that's different is that when you're writing a book by yourself, everything is so solitary, right? So if you're in like a conundrum with a character, does the character go here or a character go there? It could take me 3 days to be like, to make a decision. I'm in the shower, I'm thinking about that, I'm not really sure. I might try it out one way and then fix it and go another way. Having a wonderful co-author, you can call her, up and say, I'm not sure if she should go here or here. I'm concerned. What do you think? And Shaunna is very decisive. It might be her legal background, but she was like, we need to go that way. And I'm like, okay. And knowing that she's confident that that's the direction, it took a real burden off my back. It made things much more, I think, efficient for us to be able to always have each other as a sounding board.
Well, I'm excited to hear your answers to this next question, given where you each are in your writing careers. What one piece of advice would you share with writers who haven't yet landed an agent or who aren't yet published?
I mean, make friends with the best-selling author, but that's not really good advice.
I think my advice to aspiring authors is that you should really try and write every day if possible, to be consistent, and so that you can build out a story, because any agent is wanting to want to see a full manuscript from you. They're not going to take a representation and run a few pages. They really need to see what you can create. And so having that full manuscript is everything, right? But for me, when I was first starting out and wanting to finish my manuscript, I made my expectations on myself very easy and manageable. So I would say I'm going to write for 4 hours every day, but I'm a slow writer, so this might horrify people, but it could, I'm not going to be upset if I don't write more than 500 words, So I knew that I had to force myself to do 500 words, which is like 2 pages. But I did it every day, and I treated it like a job, that was going to be my output. And even to this day, when I write, and sometimes I do only write 500 words a day, and I have to rewrite them the next day because they're not good enough, and I'm always rewriting. It keeps me consistent. It keeps me moving towards that, focal point, which is to have a finished manuscript. And so, make it, maybe it's 250 words for you, maybe it's 100, but if you stick at it and you keep on doing it, you will have a finished manuscript eventually.
I'd love to hear about the books you're reading and loving right now. Can you tell us a bit about your reading world? What books should we not miss?
Okay, so I will say that I am a high-low reader, just like I am a high-low fashion girl. Alyson has a relatively, I don't want to say narrow, but very literary bent. I will literally read anything. So if someone leaves something in the subway, I will pick it up. I am currently reading quite an old novel. I think it's maybe published in the beginning of the 1900s, called The Pit by, I think, Frank Morris. And it's kind of like this tale of industrialist in Chicago. And I cannot tell you why I just suddenly started reading this book, but that is what I'm reading. And let me think, am I reading anything else? I don't think I'm reading anything else right now. I think that is literally what I'm reading. Oh, and I have two more chapters left. It's not a novel, in Brave Not Perfect by Reshma Saujani, who founded like Girls Who Code, because I do think that I sometimes struggle with bravery, in spite of the fact that I took this leap into being a novelist. And so I wanted to read that book to inspire me on my next feat of bravery. So that one is really good, but obviously not a novel, nonfiction.
And I am a third way through R.F. Kuang's Babel. I don't know if you've read that, Ashley, but it's really wonderful. It's beautifully written. It has an element of magic in it, which is, really fun to read. And I think what I really love about that book is her taking sort of a micro lens on the nuances of language and words, and how we each, in each culture, a word has a different layer to it that might not be translatable. And I think with Shaunna and I, when we were creating this book, one of the things that we noticed is that sometimes we heard a word differently, whether it was from our backgrounds or our heritages. And that nuance of how language hits your ear in a different way is really fascinating to me, especially coming from having always written by myself. And so, when I am writing by myself, I pick out a word very often because as I'm painting a picture, it's the word that, I associate with that visual, not necessarily the history of that word or how another person might hear it. And now I have a whole other sensitivity to it. And I love that, but I also love what in this book, Babel, of how she brings that into, just how people do translation work, how when you're trying to interpret an author's words, what words you bring to it and how you hear those words are different perhaps than the, author's original intent. So it's interesting.
Finally, I want to share how people can find you. Will you each share your website and where you like to hang out on social media?
Absolutely. So we have a website called The Thread Collectors, just like the title of our book, thethreadcollectors.com. It has all of our speaking engagements, book club questions, and all those things that make our book interesting behind the scenes. And you can find me on Instagram at Alyson Richman, just like my name, and on Facebook, Alyson Richman -author.
And on Instagram, I am at Shaunna J Edwards, just like my name, and on Facebook at Shaunna J Edwards, making it pretty easy.
And before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't yet covered? Perhaps what's next for each of you, whether you're writing another book together or Shaunna, if you're working on a solo book?
Well, I have a book coming out, another collaboration called The Friday Night Club that comes out on May 16th, which is about the artist Hilma af Klint. She was a Swedish, she's actually considered now the first abstract painter preceding even Kandinsky, although her accomplishments were sort of buried by male history prior to the explosion of in Renaissance and recognition of her work in the past couple years. So that book comes out May 16th. I have a novel coming out fall 2024, a solo book called The Timekeepers. And Shaunna, talk about what we have plans for, as a collaboration.
Absolutely. So our novel does not end in a neat little bow. So we have aspirations of taking our characters into Reconstruction and perhaps even into the 20s, the Harlem Renaissance, and even into the 60s, where we know there were so many connections between Black and Jewish communities. And in each generation, seeing this spark of musical talent and how the music industry changes against the backdrop of all of these huge historical movements. But as Alyson teaches me, because she is my writing Sherpa, we first need people to fall in love with the thread collectors first. And as Alyson well knows, I've been noodling around with two ideas, one of which is loosely inspired by my father's side of the family, because our families are more interesting than we know, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Shaunna and Alyson, I cannot thank you enough for joining me today on the Best of Women's Fiction podcast. It was really a pleasure to learn more about the Thread Collectors, what inspired it, and your paths that led you to sharing this book with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.